Hello, friends, and welcome to Stamp Chat. We're so happy that you've joined us. We opened the door just a hair early so that you all could file in and we could get started, because if this week is any indication from, we can take an indication from last week, we are going to use every minute from top to bottom. So we want to have you all come in, make yourselves comfortable, and then we can boot, scoot, and get ready for this. Part 2, luminescent tagging. Oh, we're recording. Come on in, welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad that you're joining with us on this Friday, early fall. Nice to see you. And thank you, such a great response for this 3-part series. We really appreciate you joining us, spreading the word, and connecting with us. And we're watching the room fill up. I'm going to give it a few more seconds before we get into our intro. Make yourselves comfortable. And Mr. Jehan, why don't you go ahead and share your screen? Hi, my friend Dr. Lawrence is on. Hi, Dr. Lawrence. And welcome, friends. We're going to go ahead and get started. So hello and welcome to APS Stamp Chat. My name's Heidi Rhodes. And today our Stamp Chat guest is Mr. Henry Jehan. He joins us for part 2 of his tagging series. Henry has been a stamp collector for 63 years. He began collecting when he was 10 years old. His grandfather gave him a shoebox full of U.S. stamps he had accumulated in the early 1900s when working in the mailroom at Winchester Firearms. From that beginning, Henry's interests have expanded to include the stamps of Canada, Great Britain, British Europe, and British Oceania. But the heart of his stamp collecting interest has remained with his U.S. collection. In 1963, Henry was a high school student taking classes in physics when he learned of an experiment being run by the Department of the Post Office. They were printing stamps with special ink that would glow under specific frequencies of ultraviolet light. He saw this as a perfect melding of his studies and his hobby, sparking his lifetime interest in the luminescent tagging of postage stamps from their very beginning. Henry went on to earn a Bachelor of Science in Physics at Georgia Tech and a Master of Science in Systems Management at USC. He maintained his interest in stamp collecting throughout his 31-year career as an Army civil servant, managing in the test and evaluation of military equipment, the development of range instrumentation, and the acquisition of tactical satellite communications equipment. After retiring from the Army, he worked another 10 years as a defense contractor in the development of military training systems. Now fully retired and living in Florida with his wife of 52 years, he continues to be an avid collector, a member of the Central Florida Stamp Club in Orlando, and a member of the APS. Today's Stamp Chat is sponsored by the American Philatelic Research Library. The APRL is a proud host of the Postal History Symposium. This biennial event, jointly hosted by the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the National Postal Museum, and this year by the U.S. Philatelic Classic Societies, was reimagined virtually and rescheduled for October 26th through 30th, 2020. During the 5-day symposium, there will be research presented on various aspects of postal innovation in the classic era. Each day will include 3 speakers presenting virtual sessions. This year's theme is Postal Innovation of the Classic Era, Evolution Leading to Modernization. Learn more by visiting stamps.org. Now, before we begin today, we have a few housekeeping items to take care of. Today's session is a webinar, and as such, all video and audio of attendees will be muted respectively throughout the presentation. Please feel free to use the chat box to engage with other attendees and the Q&A box for your questions to Mr. Jehan. This session is being recorded and will be made available on the APS YouTube channel. And with that, we present Luminescent Tagging Part 2, Technology Evolution. Thank you, Mr. Jehan.
Thank you, Heidi. In my last presentation, I discussed the postal history of luminescent tagging on United States postage stamps. Specifically, I discussed why we have them, how they came about, and some of the technology related to their implementation. Today, we will delve into the different techniques used to tag the stamps and how to identify them. In my previous presentation, we looked at the experimental years that brought about the luminescent tagging of postage stamps. It all began with Postmaster General Summerfield's vision to automate the post office. The first automated post office was opened in Providence, Rhode Island in 1960. Right from the beginning, they realized that the automated machinery had difficulty and reliability locating the stamps on the envelope as they were fed into the facer canceling machine. Pitney Bowes Corporation, maker of the machines, proposed using long-wave UV to highlight the stamp location. National Cash Register proposed applying an organic phosphorus compound to the stamps to make them identifiable to the automation. The NCR approach had an added benefit. It allowed the facer canceller to separate the airmail from the surface mail. In 1963, the Department of the Post Office experimented with the NCR approach with a limited use of tagged stamps in Dayton, Ohio. The initial experiment proved successful, so in 1966, they expanded it to the Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana three-state region. Subsequent to this regional implementation, the program went nationwide. In this presentation, I will discuss the various methods used to apply the taggant to the stamps. But before I go on, I need to address a couple of points brought up in the questions and comments following the Part 1 program. First, I want to thank you for identifying my typos. I tell you, cut and paste can be a blessing, but it can be a curse. Second, it was pointed out that the cover depicted at the bottom of this slide was hand canceled. After investigating why I had this discrepancy in my presentation, I realized that I pasted in the wrong picture. The picture of the correct NCR cover with a die hub cancellation from my collection is shown at the top. This is the picture that should have been on the slide. The picture with the hand cancellation is a fake. Not only is the cancellation fraudulent, the cachet on the cover is also a copy and not the real image. No, I don't own it. I saw it being sold as the real thing on eBay. After the first session, I received several questions on the difference between the terms fluorescence, luminescence, and phosphorescence. Hopefully the following explanation will clarify these terms for you. Fluorite, originally known as fluorospar, gave birth to the phenomenon known as fluorescence. It was first discovered and named by George Stokes in 1852. It is the first official fluorescent mineral, and it can be found around the globe. In addition to fluorite, over 500 minerals have been discovered that exhibit some sort of fluorescence when exposed to ultraviolet light. Some are fluorescent in long-wave UV, some are fluorescent in short-wave UV. Fluorescent materials emit light usually in the visible spectrum when excited by a light of different wavelength, usually in this UV spectrum. There are two types of fluorescence: luminescence and phosphorescence. Luminescent materials emit visible light when illuminated with a UV light source. The visible light goes away when the light source is removed. Luminescence is the type of tagging that is done on US stamps. Phosphorescent materials also emit visible light when illuminated with a UV light source. Depending upon the material, the visible light lingers on for a few seconds to many minutes when the light source is removed. Some foreign countries use phosphorescence rather than luminescence on their stamps. Phosphor is the generic term for any chemical compound that exhibits fluorescence. So the material that we use as the taggant, we refer to as a phosphor. But phosphors are not and do not contain the chemical element phosphorus, which is not fluorescent and is totally separate from the phenomena of fluorescence. Now, I do need to warn you, never look directly into the light emitted by a UV lamp. Direct exposure to UV light, particularly shortwave UV light, which is also known as UVB, will do permanent damage to your eyes. When working with a UV light source, you should always wear glasses containing a UV blocker. The light emitted by the stamps when illuminated with the UV light source is eye safe. It is the UV light source used to illuminate the stamps that is not eye safe. As long as you do not look into the UV light source or allow it to be reflected into your eyes by stamp mounts or other mirror surfaces, working with tagged stamps is perfectly safe. However, if you work extensively with the UV light for long periods of time, you should consider wearing gloves and long sleeve shirts to limit skin exposure and prevent sunburn and related ill effects. All early US tagged stamps were overall tagged. After printing, the face of a stamp was coated with all over with phosphotaggant suspended in a varnish. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing came up with several ways to apply the taggant. The various methods used to apply the taggant left distinctive and consistent markings on the stamp that are visible under shortwave ultraviolet light. The results are referred to herein as application types of overall tagging, and while not catalog rated, they are hard to find and are collectible. The Bureau's first approach to apply the taggant to stamps was to overprint the stamps using rubber mats as the printing plates. This became known as a Type 1 tag. The second method replaced the rubber mats with a rubber roller. This became known as a Type 2 tag. The next improvement was to print the taggant on a rotary press where the transfer plate for the taggant was a smooth piece of steel. It is noteworthy that many early tagged issues were overall tagged using more than one application type. For example, the 8-cent airmail sheet stamp, that's Scott C65A, was overall tagged as Type 1, Type 2, and Type 2A configurations. About 30 stamps were overall tagged with multiple application types during this experimental period. Later, when it became commonplace to print the taggant as another color in the printing of a vignette, block tagging was introduced. Initially used in 1963 and 1964, Type 1 tagging was applied by 4 matched blank rubber mats affixed to a metal saddle and attached to a round cylinder, which was then mounted on the letterpress printing station of the Cottrell press. When applied to sheet stamps, the taggant covered all stamps in each pane, but not the entire marginal selvage. The very outside edge of the wide plate number margin was untagged. The short side margin was completely untagged. If the 4 mats were not tightly butted together on the cylinder, untagged horizontal and vertical gaps where the 4 mats joined together could result. These gaps would normally fall between the panes, but could fall onto the stamps if the mats were not properly aligned around the cylinder. Horizontal gaps, such as parallel lines parallel to the short side of the stamp, are scarce. Because the shape and layout of the tagging mats did not match the plate layouts of coil and booklet stamps, the horizontal and vertical tagging gaps could appear in random positions on coils and booklets. The process was used randomly in the later years, although it was the Type 1 process was used on everything to start. Later on, as the other processes became available, occasionally Type 1 tagging would appear. This slide shows the Type 1 tagging on a commemorative issue, and note that both selvages are untagged. The salvage, well, let me get to the next slide. Because the clear varnish used to apply the taggant has yellowed, these early tagging applications are visible on the stamps under the ambient light. This is the same thing I pointed out when we looked at the City Mail stamp in the previous presentation. You can, on these early taggings, you can see where the taggant is without using light. Now this slide shows type 1 tagging where the 4 mats meet at the center of the press sheet. So what we are looking at here is one corner of the press sheet, one central corner of the press sheet where the press sheet would be split to produce 4 separate sheets of stamps. And the National Park Service Scott 1314A block on this slide shows the horizontal and vertical gap lines at the rubber mat joints. Both the selvages are tagged because this block came from the center gutter of a 200 stamp sheet. The block also exhibits the mottled effect in the taggant caused by the wear on the mat surface that resulted from abrasion caused by the phosphor in the taggant. Type 1 taggant. Stamps with type 1 taggant are almost always mottled like this stamp. On this slide, a dark blue untagged type 1 joint line splits the right-hand side of the stamp of this tagged coil pair, where type 1 tagging was used to tag the coil. The type 1 joint lines are caused by the joints between the rubber mats, and the taggant joint lines do not normally align with the visible joint lines. They can be found running the length of the coil and or across the coil, as in this example, depending upon how they fell in the printing process. In his research and collecting, Borger demonstrated that the efforts by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing to reduce the type 1 gaps. As we have already shown, the type 1 tagging gaps were caused by the joints between the 4 rubber mats. When coil stamps were printed and tagged, these tagging gaps occurred every 24th stamp. The Post Office Department Philatelic Division saw that collectors would see these as collectible variants and ordered the Bureau of Engraving and Printing to eliminate the gaps. The picture on this slide shows coil pairs from Borger's collection. It shows a series of pairs with successively smaller taggant gap lines. The top thick gap is from an early printing, the bottom minimal gap from a later printing. Borger published this picture in his handbook on U.S. luminescent stamps. He inserted small arrows to highlight the blemishes from the mat attachment screws. And the little arrows are shown by my cursor right there, and there's another one up at the top. There are 2 of them on this particular chart. The introduction of type 2 tagging using silicone rollers eliminated the gaps between the rubber mats. In 1964, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing introduced type 2 tagging. Type 2 tagging used a silicone rubber roller around a cylinder that was again mounted on the letterpress station of the Cottrell press. Like the rubber mats it replaced, this roller was not wide enough to apply tagging to the full width of the web. Thus, for sheet stamps, the outside portion of the wide plate number margin was untagged. Because the roller was seamless, there are no tagging gaps or joint lines. In the production of coils and booklet panes, they were completely tagged because the untagged part of the margin was usually trimmed off in the finishing process. In 1965, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing introduced type 2A print tagging. This method of application was the same as that used for the type 2 tagging, except that a wider roller was used, applying a taggant to the full width of the web, or very close to the full width, which fully or nearly tagged all the margins or selvage. Type 2A tagging can be identified by the mottled effect in the taggant created by the wear on the roller surface from the abrasion of the phosphor, and in some cases by the very small untagged strip along the plate number selvage. On this particular chart, or on the right-hand side, you see the green taggant, and then you see the black background, and in between there's a very thin gray line. That is the untagged strip left by the type 2A tagging. The silicone rubber coating on the type 2 and 2A rollers proved to be less durable than desired, leading to the Bureau's development of the type 3 application method. Implemented in 1966, a pair of blank semicircular steel plates were joined around a cylinder which was mounted on the Intaligo printing station of the Cottrell press. This was a different press setup from the earlier tagging methods and required a time-consuming second pass through the printing station to apply the taggant prior to gumming and finishing. On a type 3 tag, all margins or selvage are tagged like with a type 2A. Because the steel plates did not fit together perfectly, where the plates were joined created a joint gap in taggant similar to that of a coil line pair. This gap could result in either tagging gap lines from the absence of tagging or tagging hot lines, which were more intense bright tagging from a buildup of taggant. These tagging joint lines are parallel to the visible joint lines in a hit or miss fashion. In some cases, the plate gap may also physically emboss a pair of parallel lines into the paper. On this slide, at the lower left is an example of a parallel tagging gap lines on the short horizontal axis caused by a lack of taggant at the joint of the steel plates applying the taggant, obviously off of a perforated sheet and not a coil. At the lower right is an example of a bright line across the short axis of the stamp resulting from a deposit of taggant built up between the two steel plates applying the taggant. While there is some difference in the appearance of the taggant on the individual stamps, depending upon which printing method was used, in many cases, the tagging type can only be identified from the plate number selvage. In many cases, type 2A and type 3 tagging is indistinguishable. In some cases, an individual stamp will exhibit a type 1 gap from a matte misalignment or a type 3 joint line, gap, or hot line. And generally, type 3 tagging is much more uniform and brighter than either type 1 or type 2 or type 2A tagging. In his handbook on the U.S. luminescent stamps, Borger tells us that on October 17, 1966, the Bureau of Printing and Engraving began production on an order of 3-cent Statue of Liberty stamps in coils of 3,000. The order was prepared for Look magazine, which is why the printing became known as the Look coil. Type 2 tagging was used in the manufacture of these stamps, which resulted in their having a very uniform and bright application of the taggant. The Look coil stamps were not recognized by the Post Office Department as philatelically significant at the time of their printing. The fact that this printing was the first tagged production of the 3-cent Statue of Liberty coil went unnoticed. And it wasn't until April 1967 when the philatelic community discovered their existence. At a time of discovery, the Post Office Department withdrew 32 coils of the 3,000 stamp rolls for philatelic sales, but they sold out very quickly. The Post Office Department then placed an order to print an additional quantity, but when the order was executed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing on June 14, 1967, the result was the creation of a new stamp. The reprints, which are designated Scott 1057B, were produced in coils of 500. The reprints have a sharper and more defined image, a more intense shade of purple ink, and a slightly fluorescent bright paper. The tagging is less intense, and some of the stamps have across-the-web marks in the tagging, often called hot lines, which repeat every 24 stamps. And the reason for the hot lines being the reprints at the bottom of this slide were done with a type 3 tag as opposed to the original looks, which were done with the type 2 tag. Similar thing happened again with the Disabled Veterans of America. DAV preferred to use low denomination multiples whenever possible to make up their first class postage rate. So in 1968, with the first class rate at 6 cents, they gave an order to the Cincinnati postmaster for 2-cent Jefferson coils. And they had the order sent to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, where they were produced on the Cottrell press and finished in rolls of 3,000 stamps. The bulk of this printing order was sent to Cincinnati, with a portion sent to the philatelic sales unit. The date of issue is given as May 6, 1968, and this became the first 2-cent tag stamp, which is the one shown at the top. A planned second printing of the 2-cent Jefferson coil was issued on April 10, 1971. This issue was finished in rolls of 500 stamps. Collectors eventually noted that these stamps appeared to be different from the 1968 printing in regard to ink and paper. Moreover, tagging specialists found the tagging on the second printing to be dull and grainy with hot lines found on some coils, whereas the tagging on the first printing was bright and clear. However, unlike the tag 3-cent Statue of Liberty coil, the second printing never received a unique catalog number. But just like the 3-cent Statue of Liberty coil, the first printing was a type 2 tag and the second printing was a type 3 tag. In 1974, there was a third printing that was very similar to the second printing without any documented identification to identify which printing you have. So the second and third printings melded together as undistinguishable. Both the 1971 printings of this coil are dry printings from the 432 subject plates and finished with small perforation holes. The second printing is visually clearer print. The sharpness of the line is distinctive and gives the stamp a slightly darker shade of carmine rose color. The gum on that printing is white. That is the one on the bottom, the gum is white. That of the first printing, the one at the top, has a more yellow tone to it, and some dealers call it brown gum. Chow and Newhart note that there's no discernible difference in the paper, color, texture, or thickness of these stamps. According to Borger, excessive printer's waste was discovered on the 1966 Tagged National Park Service and Beautification of America issues. To produce the additional stock needed, tagging ink was applied to already printed and perforated sheets of 200 stamps using an offset press. The result was the creation of a uniquely identifiable tagged after perforation or TAP stamps. So here we have the visible picture of both the national park and the beautification. The reverse of the stamp exhibit a glow around the perforation holes where the taggant ran through the perforation holes in the paper. And you can see that you have green lines that run along all of the perforation holes. Wait a minute. And on this slide, it shows that on the obverse, in the tagging itself, you see circle marks that randomly occur. The circle marks are visible on both plate blocks in this slide, and Borger reports that these circles appear randomly all over the sheet, and that some of these tap stamps with the circle markers in the tagging actually made it onto some of the first day covers. So there are first day covers out there with these tagged stamps that have the tagged circle markers visible under the UV light. The National Park Service issue is rather unique in that there are several variants of the same stamp, some of which are shown on this slide. There is an untagged version, the original tagged version with a type 1 tagging, which was like we saw on the block a few slides ago. A tapped version done with type 2 tagging. A tapped version done with type 2A tagging, and an additional printing with type 2A tagging that's not tapped. These variants support Borger's account regarding this printing. First, the untagged stamps were printed. Then the tagging station configured for type 1 tagging was activated to print the tagged stamps. When it was realized that an insufficient quantity of stamps had been tagged, previously printed but not yet perforated stamps were fed through a second press configured for type 2A tagging. Realizing that this would not fill the order, previously perforated stamps were run through a third press configured through this third press configured for type 2 tagging, and when the press configured for type 2A tagging ran out of unperforated sheets, they began running the previously perforated sheets through that press as well. So you ended up with tagging done with type 1, type 2, and type 2A, some done on sheets that had not yet been perforated and some done on sheets that had been perforated. The result was one printing producing using multiple presses, creating 5 different versions of the same stamp. In 1966, the 4-cent Lincoln postcard was reprinted on dead non-phosphorescent paper using ink containing the taggant. The new tagged version which was noted as a Scott UX48A, was issued on June 25, 1966, and became the first tagged postal stationery. Here is what it looks like under the shortwave UV. On this slide, you can easily see that putting the phosphor in the ink resulted in a color change from the non-phosphored postcard. So at the top, you have the non-phosphored original postcard, and at the bottom, you have the phosphor in the ink, which lights up like the previous slide. Overall tagging as an overprint was used to tag stamps throughout the experimental period. In 1968, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing again experimented with putting the taggant in the ink, this time on a stamp. The first stamp to be uniquely produced in this manner was the 6 cents Leif Erikson issue. This stamp was printed using two printing technologies. First, the background was lithographed with the tagged ink, and second, the engraved image of the statue was printed over the lithographed background using untagged ink. This process left about 1/3 of the vignette and the selvage untagged. 20 years later, in 1988, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing again experimented putting the taggant in the ink. This was on the lithographed classic automobiles booklet stamps, where the tagged ink was used to print the ground beneath the automobiles. This worked out a little better for them because it did not require 2 passes through the press. But it was another 10 years. The third try at putting the taggant into the colored ink was used to print the vignette 11 years later in 1999 on the beach umbrella stamp. The booklet pane was printed by lithography with phosphor in the ink depicting the, well, I'm on the wrong chart, depicting the sand. My charts move more easily than I'd like them to. A significant problem with the overall tagging process was identified early on in the experimental program. The problem was that the phosphor in a taggant is highly abrasive and corrosive. These characteristics significantly shortened the life of the perforation pins and knife blades used in the perforation and shearing process. The ability of the Huck press to handle the taggant as just another ink in the printing process offered a significant improvement that would extend the life of the perforation pins and knife blades. This improvement was block tagging, not to print the taggant in the gutters between the vignettes, so that the sheet is not tagged where the perforations are punched and the sheets are sheared. Block tagging was first introduced on the 1968 Christmas stamp, Scott 1363, using a Huck multicolor press. In 1970, the Bureau of Printing and Engraving began experimenting with the capabilities of the new Andretti multicolor press. Initially, the Bureau did not own an Andretti press, so they prepared plates to be printed in contractor facilities. The first stamps printed on the Andretti press were the 1970 6-cent anti-pollution issue, and then the 1970 6-cent Christmas stamps. Because the multicolor Andretti press required dash or slash-shaped registration marks for each color of ink, and the taggant was treated as one of the inks in the printing process, the two issues exhibit dash and cross-shaped registration marks in the phosphor ink. On subsequent issues, the inclusion of the registration marks in the taggant ink was discontinued because they made no sense. The optical sensors that control the registration on the press could not detect them. The circles on this slide highlight the registration marks on the 1970 6-cent anti-pollution issue. Invisible in the ambient light, but clearly visible under the short wave. You see on the left, next to the plate number, there is nothing in the ambient light picture, but in the UV picture, there is a cross. And on the right-hand side, next to the tag that says Mayo early in the day, you have the two slash registration lines, which show up nicely in the UV, but not in the visible. This shows the same phenomena on the 1970 6-cent Christmas stamp. In this case, it's the pre-cancel version, but the phenomenon is the same on both the pre-cancel and the non-pre-canceled. The next major innovation in the tagging of U.S. stamps came about in 1973 when the Bureau of Printing and Engraving began to employ the full capabilities of the new Andretti press that they had acquired in 1971. The first stamp printed on the new press was the 1971 Prevent Drug Abuse issue. As were most of the preceding tag stamps, this issue was completely overprinted with the taggant. However, it was soon realized that the capabilities of the Andretti press allowed the taggant to be applied as part of the stamp design. The first attempt at doing this was in the printing of the 100th anniversary of mail order. Rather than overprinting the entire vignette of the stamp, the taggant was laid down as a 10mm wide band that ran vertically through the center of each stamp. The strip of taggant is a continuous band that extends through the perforations and across the selvage or gutter between the sheets. This use of band taggant was employed a second time on the 1973 Postal Service Employees issue. By adjusting the strip of taggants so that it skipped over the perforations, small block tagging was introduced on the 1973 8-cent Christmas stamp, both Scott 1507 and 1508. Small block tagging was employed on only 3 other commemorative issues: the 1974 horse racing issue, the 1975 collective bargaining issue, and the 1976 Olympic Games Say-Tent set of 4. After the Olympic Games issue, the use of small block tagging on commemorative size stamps was discontinued. All the various printing processes used for applying the taggant involve printing the taggant as an overprint or as part of the vignette. However, it appears that the Bureau of Engraving and Printing may have done some experimentation in the formulation of the ink or lacquer used to apply the taggant. On a few stamps issued in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it appears that the taggant migrated to the gum side of the mint stamps so that under shortwave UV, the reverse side of the stamp glows green. From my limited observations, this taggant migration does not seem to occur on used stamps that have been soaked off the envelopes. From this, I conclude that on some mint stamps, the taggant appears to have migrated into the gum on the stamp above it when the sheets of stamps were stacked for packaging and distribution. Phosphor migration was reported also on some Canadian stamps during this period, so this appears to be an area worth some additional investigation. In 1987, the USPS experimented with a new method of tagging stamps, the use of pre-phosphored paper. On pre-phosphored paper, the taggant is added to the raw paper before the vignette is printed. The final appearance of pre-phosphored tagging depends upon the coating that already exists on the paper. Pre-phosphored coated stamps have a very solid appearance under the UV light. Because the coated paper allows the taggant to attach evenly to the surface of the smooth paper, such as the top image on this slide. Pre-phosphored uncoated stamps have a mottled or grainy appearance under UV light. The taggant is applied to the paper before any coating is applied, so the taggant soaks into the paper and pools in the fibers in an uneven way. The result is that the tagging is often fainter and sometimes looks bluish under the UV light. As a test of using pre-phosphored paper, the previously issued block tagged 22-cent flag over the Capitol coil was reprinted on pre-phosphored coated paper and given number Scott 2115C. Because this printing was a test of how well pre-phosphored paper would perform in the automated handling of the mail, the vignette was identified with a T so that the stamps printed on the pre-phosphored paper would be readily recognized if rejected by the facer cancelers. This was the last of the experiments that were done with luminescent tagging. The 1987 test of pre-phosphored paper was apparently a success because in 1989, the U.S. Postal Service issued the first full production stamp on pre-phosphored paper, the block tag 25-cent flag over Yosemite, previously issued in 1988, was reprinted on pre-phosphored uncoated paper and issued on February 14, 1989. Since 1988, all tag stamps have been printed on either pre-phosphored or unphosphored paper with either block or all over tagging. While the United States implemented the use of red, orange, and blue-green taggants, some other countries took different approaches. Most notably was Great Britain, where tagging was implemented using a blue phosphor. Blue phosphor appeared to be for the first time on a US stamp in 1982 on the State Birds and Flowers stamp. Supposedly printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing using the Andretti press, there is no obvious reason for the change in tag and color, unless the Bureau is doing some sort of unpublicized experiment. As you can see in this slide, under the shortwave UV, the taggant illuminates almost the same color as the bright paper on which it is printed. So you have blue taggant blocks on a bright paper that lights up blue. The next example of a blue taggant on a US stamp is on the 1983 Treaty of Amity and Commerce 200th anniversary joint issue with Sweden. This issue was printed by the American Banknote Company, and since it is a joint issue, one might think it was tagged blue to be consistent with the Swedish joint issue. But when illuminated with shortwave UV, one sees that the Swedish stamp is not tagged. Further investigation revealed that the Swedish tagged their airmail red-orange, but do not tag their surface mail. Another example of a US stamp tagged in other than the traditional green is the second printing of the 1998 $1 red fox. In this issue, we have a tag that is almost white. So you're looking at the bottom here, the first printing with the green tagging, the second printing with the white tagging. In 1976, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing used two different presses to print the 13-cent Christmas stamp depicting the painting Winter Pastime by Nathaniel Currier. The one printed on the Andretti press, Scott 1702, shown at the left, is overall tagged, while the one printed on the combination press, Scott 1703, is block tagged. Because there were slight differences in the appearance of the stamps and ambient light, they were given separate Scott numbers. But they are also the first stamps that were printed, one stamp printed in two different tagging configurations of blocked and overall. The same issue being the aquarium stamps brings up this same issue again. The same issue being printed with both block and overall tagging occurred again in 1999 with the 33-cent aquarium fish. Because the two variants were not visibly different in ambient light, and because they were contract printed without details on the press used, they did not receive separate Scott numbers. Had the tag been visible, the block tagged and overall tagged aquarium stamps would have been clearly identified as separate and unique stamps, a type 1 or type 2 as such, or given separate Scott numbers, because the plate configuration to print them has to be different. The first EFO on a US tag stamp occurred on the printing of the 100th anniversary of City Mail, the first stamp to receive the blue-green taggant. Since then, there have been many documented EFOs, but they all fall into variants listed on this slide. Either the press ran out of ink, creating an untagged version, the tagging process was misregistered, there was too much ink applied, or there were defects such as gaps, cracks, or voids in the transfer plates. We all owe a great debt of gratitude to Mr. Alfred G. Tagborger. Tag, as he became known, was a newspaper reporter and stamp collector in Toledo, Ohio. He chronicled the tagging experiment in Dayton and the subsequent tri-state experiment. In doing this, he collected much of the early material, created first day covers for the various issues, and became a dealer specializing in the tagged material. His handbook on US luminescent stamps is still, to my knowledge, the principal reference available on this subject. And it was thanks to him that I was able to acquire much of this knowledge and many of the samples that you saw depicted earlier in this presentation. So are there any questions?
Okay, fantastic. And of course there are questions. Thank you, Mr. Jehan. Alrighty.
Let's see, I guess, stop sharing my screen and come
Okay.
back so people can actually see that I'm a human being and not just a slide that talks.
Not just a slide, not at all. You know what's up. Oh, we've got a friend from overseas. Okay. So let's start with the chat box. And friends, if you don't mind using the Q&A box, that makes it easier, just for organization. So let's start with question 1. Do you have a list of all the US stamps that had the different early tagging types? I have an old Minkus catalog from 1980 that has a section on luminescent stamps listing all the early tag stamps. Do you know if it is accurate, or is the Borger Luminescent Handbook more accurate?
That is a good question, and I cannot definitively answer that. I can say that I put out a handout for you all with the first program that lists all of the experimental tag stamps, and it lists them all from the original C65A on up to the point where all stamps started becoming tagged. The question, but that does not address the question of different tagging types. And Borger has identified some of it, but I personally have not had the resources to go through and verify or expand that list. It's something that would be lovely to do. But I know that there's about 30 stamps that were done in more than one tagging type, but I can't say definitively that each of these stamps were done. And for example, I can say that a C65A was done with type 1, type 2, and type 2A. But I can't say definitively that kind of a statement about all of the stamps in the period.
Friends, I see in the question box and in the chat box, the handout you can find on stamps.org. If you go to the news section, you'll see a nice image of Mr. Jehan and his series. And if you click on that story, you'll have the handout available. Additionally, if you subscribe to our Stamp Chat newsletter, we have embedded that handout there, so you can have access. You can feel free to toggle over to stamps.org/news to find that handout right now. Speaking of, in the handout provided last week, the notes at the bottom of the second table show the City Mail stamp as red orange tag. Shouldn't it specify blue green?
Yes, it should, and it sounds like a typo.
Okay.
I guess I have another typo to go chase down.
We always have editors in Philately. It's a beautiful thing. Would you review your recommendations for UV equipment, followed by wonderful presentation?
Oh, that's a question we had last time too. I don't have any strong recommendations by manufacturer. I know that there's a lot of good stuff out there these days. I got started in this so early that when I started, there were no lights commercially available to look at stamps. If you went down to the stamp dealer and asked about a light to light up my UV tagging, I got the deer in the headlights look. So I found that I had to go to the rock and mineral collectors place, and I found that they had lights specifically to light up the fluorescence and luminescence. So I had one that was specifically made with a notched filter at the frequency of the red, orange, and blue-green tag that the U.S. Post Office was using. And I've been using that as my go-to light ever since. Now, there's been a problem that I've had in that foreign countries don't all use the same frequency. So my light was too narrow to light up, particularly my British stamps. So I had to find something better to do that. I found that you can get these battery-powered lights that use a fluorescent tube for the shortwave UV, and they take 4 AA batteries, and they do a pretty good job of giving a broad spectrum of shortwave, which lights up not only the US stuff, but the foreign stuff. And they're very useful in if you're trying to photograph the stamps, because they put out much brighter light. So you get a much more volume of light to light up a larger area. And that has helped me a lot in my photographing. So usually when I'm photographing, I actually light with both my lights. But all I can really say about the battery powered ones is if you get one, make sure you remove the batteries every time you're done using it.
More on the light. When should we use shortwave UV lamp and when long wave UV lamp? Can we use them, you know, indistinctly? I'm not even sure that's a word, but perhaps it is. Or is there one that is best for luminescent and one for phosphorescent identification?
It depends on what you're trying to look at. Long wave UV will make the paper glow, the bright paper we talked about in the first session. Long wave UV will make some foreign stamps glow, like the yellow frames around the Canadian stamps. They glow very nicely in long wave UV. And there are probably a lot of other countries that will light up nicely in long wave UV. The other really good use for long wave UV, if you are into working with the US banknotes from way back in the late 1800s, if you remember, there was a differentiation between them, between soft and hard paper. Well, the differentiation in the UV world is that hard paper in that period had a UV activator in it, and the soft paper is totally dead paper. So you can use a long wave UV and you can separate your hard and soft paper in your banknotes very, very quickly, instead of trying to snap them and listen to your ear and all that sort of thing. Now the short wave is to specifically pick up the tagant. The tagant on US stamps only glows under shortwave UV. The tagant on other countries varies on how the country implemented tagging in their particular country. But shortwave UV, for the most part, will light up the tagant on most everybody's. But if you want to see them glow green or glow red-orange, then you have to use shortwave.
Thank you. Yes, the slides, well, if they'll be available as a PDF, we can work on that. Join us next week when we have, Mr. Jehan is giving us at least 30 minutes after the program, and we can discuss that. I have some stamps with a very bright white stamp and a very dark stamp, which is the untagged. This is seen on the 1 cent inkwell.
If one is very bright white and the other one is dark, you're seeing this in ambient light. So you're looking at either some difference in the printing ink or the paper set that was used. To actually know which one's tagged or not, you got to light it up with the shortwave UV, and you may find that they're both tagged. You're looking at different characteristics between tagging and visible color.
Jean Paquette issued a catalog of modern varieties that had a useful section on tagging. Might be an additional resource to Tag Boger's handbook. Okay.
Who was this, Jean?
Jean Paquette, P-A-Q-U-E-T-T-E. Thank you, Mr. Borsting, for that.
I need to find out about that.
Let's see what else we have here, friends. Are all hand canceled C64A first day covers counterfeit?
In my opinion, yes. And the reason is what they were celebrating. Now, and maybe then I got to rephrase that. It depends on what we're trying to measure it for. They could very well be first day issues of a C64A, but they are not first day issues of the equipment that mated with the 64A to make the whole set and team. That's the facer canceller. The Mark II facer canceller and its ability to detect that stamp and cancel it with high accuracy is what the issue was all about. And to have those, you have to have the die hub. If you have a cover that has a hand canceled stamp, it means that somebody got the stamp and made a first day cover of it and hand canceled it and put it into the postal system, but it didn't go through the actual process that was being tested and commemorated by that stamp.
Let's see how I read this question. Why does it get Scott 1703 and not 1702A?
1703. Okay, I believe we're talking about the Nathaniel Courier's Christmas. And they were printed on two different presses. And so the one press made an image that was visibly in ambient light different than the image from the other press. The second press had snowflaking in the sky and not quite so sharp an image. So it was that separated it into two Scott numbers. And the fact that the one was block tagged and one was overall tagged, Scott was totally oblivious to that whole situation.
All right, well, here's one. Where are copies of your book, the book that you referred to last week? Asks a person.
So that would be Borger's book.
Okay.
And it's the one I showed tonight too. And it is technically out of print. The last printing that I'm aware of was 1975. And you can find them in used bookstores and dealers of philatelic material. I don't know, maybe the APS library would have a copy. I would think they would, being that Tag was an APS member. But you know, I happen to have it because I bought it from him back then. Our stamp club has one too because I gave him one.
Incredible, Mr. Jehan. Yes, and we have an attendee who is verifying that the APRL has sold them. Okay, so we have a long question coming up. Get ready. Here we go. How many early tagged stamps used both type 2A and 3 taggings? On your 2 slides showing these 2 types, 1283A was used with the type 2A example, with a plate number used for both tagged and untagged issues, while your type 3 slide had a plate block used for only tagged issues of number 1283A. My source is the Derlin catalog. Would it be accurate to say that 1283A plate numbers used for both tagged and untagged stamps could be type 2A tagging, and plate numbers used on this stamp for just tagging might be type 3 only?
I would say that it sounds like a good assumption or a good conclusion. I personally do not have the expertise, or maybe I should say the hands-on knowledge to say with certainty that that is a fact. But we do know that when they first started tagging these previously untagged stamps, you had stamps that were printed untagged, and then they started tagging them for the experiments that they were doing in the tri-state area. They didn't change the plates. They just added the tag it. So it makes sense that you would have an untagged and a tagged type 1 stamp, possibly a tagged type 2 stamp. Then later, when they still had to produce more, it's reasonable to think that they produced new plates and printed new plate numbers that were just tagged. But I don't have any of that information, and I think to really verify that with true accuracy, we'd have to dig into the archives of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing and look at those records of exactly what they did in the production of that stuff. I believe that kind of information is available. I just don't know where. I've never pursued any of that. That's entirely too technical for my collecting interest.
Well, to expand on that whole idea of the interest, there is tremendous interest. Thank you, Mr. Jehan, for bringing this to the philatelic community in luminescent tagging. And friends, if you look in the chat box, we had a gentleman write to us who would like to start kind of an informal study group on tagging, and you'll find his email in the chat box. That's L. Cooper, COOPER, at parkland.edu, and perhaps we'll put that on the YouTube as well in the comments. But take note of that email if tagging, you want to keep talking tagging. And with that, we're going to put a pin in today's tagging discussion and be ready for next week. Yes, you can find part 1 on YouTube. We will have part 2 available on YouTube next week, so be on the lookout for that. We have put the handout PDF in the chat box link. And again, it is also available on stamps.org/news. I want to thank Mr. Jehan. Thank you so much for bringing so much enthusiasm and knowledge and expertise to this topic. And we just love having so many people join us for Stamp Chat. Next week, we'll conclude the part 3 series, so have your questions ready. And Mr. Jehan, as I mentioned, is going to be generous enough and offer at least 30 minutes after Stamp Chat ends. So we'll probably stop the recording at the 4 o'clock hour and then have a nice chat, maybe even put on cameras and unmute your mics. Today's Stamp Chat was sponsored by the American Philatelic Research Library. When you become a member of the American Philatelic Society, you have access to the largest philatelic library in the world. That's the largest borrowing public library. If you're an APS member, you're able to borrow materials from the library or request scans, photocopies, or research for all your philatelic questions. To find out more about the library, visit our webpage at stamplibrary.org and explore all the services we provide for both members and non-members. For more Stamp Chats, visit and subscribe to the APS YouTube channel, where you can find over 65 presentations. Use the comment box below the video to keep the conversation going. And if you'd like to keep abreast of upcoming Stamp Chats, go ahead and be sure to subscribe to our newsletter that's dedicated to Stamp Chats. You can find that and subscribe at stamps.org. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you on the next Stamp Chat. Until then, find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and of course, stamps.org. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much, friends.